Colonel, welcome here, my dear friend. We much appreciate your time. In your view, is the United States at war with Russia?
Effectively, yes. Sadly, without any formal declaration, without consulting the American people, we are very definitely in a condition of war with Russia. And I think that's what the Russians have concluded. It's very dangerous. And I wish it were not the case, but I'm afraid it is.
Is there a rational explanation from the American perspective of the terror that was visited on Russian civilians on a beach Sunday afternoon in Sevastopol?
Well, one analysis suggests that the reason for the deposit of cluster munitions from the MLRS weapon system that fell near the beach or into the water and unfortunately killed people and injured several people, including children, is because the Russian missile defense systems worked. They were able to destroy all of the missiles except one, and they actually diverted the last missile from its course, damaged it so that the cluster munitions fell to the earth much further away from the original target. Now, the key thing to keep in mind is that those cluster munitions did not explode. They simply struck people and caused their death. But because they had interrupted the flight of the missile and the warhead, the cluster munitions were apparently not armed. And so at least they did not explode, which would have been a much worse outcome.
Isn't that 6 of one, half a dozen of the other? Because dud clusters explode at some later date when they're discovered by a 6-year-old who thinks they're a rock or a baseball?
Well, potentially. And I actually was surprised that they were in use at all, because I thought that based on the 91 experience where we saw this happen, saw children in Iraq, even some soldiers who were told to not do it, but weren't very smart at the time and picked up these bomblets, lost their hands or were severely injured or even killed. So I thought the whole thing was off the table, but I guess I was wrong. And it may be. It's another case of running out of existing munitions and not being able to rapidly restore the arsenal with new ones. I mean, frankly speaking, we don't have very many of these missiles left at this point. And as far as I know, there are no plans to go to shifts on a 24-hour basis in order to make missiles.
Why are we? Why is the U.S. delivering to Ukraine a weapon? Well, not a weapon, but ammunition, which is unlawful in 95% of the world?
That's a question I can't answer, and neither can you, because we don't know what the orders were that were given. I suspect, again, they ran out of high explosive warheads, and what they had left is what was used. And the orders were, doesn't matter, send whatever we've got to Ukraine, we'll fire whatever is left. It's the only way I can explain it.
Here's the Russian ambassador to the UN, seems to have a good handle on what happened. Cut number 10.
Kiev regime, supported by the USA, carried out a heinous attack against civilians in the Russian city of Sevastopol in Crimea. Ukraine launched 5 US-supplied Attack-MS missiles armed with cluster munitions. An American Global Hawk UAV was patrolling the airspace over the Crimean Peninsula. There will be measures in response. The Russian Federation will continue to protect its people and its national security until no threat is posed by the neo-Nazi regime in Kiev that was breeded, raised, and financed by the West.
Raises: 1, cluster munitions, and 2, breeded, raised, and financed by the West. How do you think Russia will respond with President Putin's typical patience, or with something that sends a dramatic message?
Well, I think your point is accurate in that this is not the first provocation. If we stop and consider the strike that struck the early warning ballistic missile system radar, that in and of itself could have resulted in an immediate counter strike by the Russians. It didn't happen, primarily because President Putin wants to avoid a direct confrontation with the United States and NATO. He's never wanted it. We're the ones that goaded him into attacking into eastern Ukraine to begin with. We're the ones that wanted to place forces right on his border with the goal of attacking him. We're the ones that wanted to place missile systems there. So I think it's very obvious that under the circumstances, he could have attacked with any number of different weapon systems a long time ago, and he hasn't done it. I hope he can continue to exercise restraint, because I think we're nearing the end of this tragedy, frankly.
How much longer before we get to nearing the end, why would they have done this on a Sunday afternoon, on a Sunday that is a feast day, a high feast day? It's Pentecost Sunday in the Russian Orthodox Church. Everybody's off and the beaches are packed, unless they wanted to injure or kill civilians.
Well, I'm sure that's not an unreasonable conclusion if you're a Russian. Clearly, one of the things that we have to note is that this regime in Kyiv treats Christianity with complete contempt. They've shut down churches. They've imprisoned members of the clergy. So that's unsurprising. This is a very nihilistic, atheistic regime in Kyiv, which may be why the globalist elites in Washington and in places like Paris and London are so excited about attacking Russia. They wanted this sort of nihilistic, atheistic approach adopted here in the United States. We know that from experience during COVID. So I guess you have to accept the fact that this looks deliberate.
Do you think there's a connection between what happened on the beach in Sevastopol and the attributed to ISIS attack on a synagogue and on a Russian Orthodox church the same day, where a Russian Orthodox priest had his throat slit on the altar of the church?
Well, it's a legitimate question. I don't know why the Islamists would have done what they did, except that they were provided with some incentive to do so. I mean, now,
by the Ukrainians?
Yeah, well, potentially by the Western intelligence organizations, MI6, the CIA. I mean, obviously, they have the capacity to do that sort of thing. And we've done it before in places like Syria, where we aligned ourselves with the Sunni Islamists to do enormous damage to Assad and his regime. I can't answer those questions. I don't have access to the intelligence on the inside to call it as whatever it may be, but it looks very troubling. And
okay.
We have to keep something in mind, that Putin has done an exemplary job of making the Muslim citizens of Russia comfortable. They don't fear any sort of oppression. They're not worried about the Russian state going after them for any particular reason. So there's been remarkable peace inside Russia between Muslims and Christians. So this comes at a strange point in time, and it does beg the question, why now, and why would they do what they did? But I don't know the answer, Judge. I can't say definitively Western intelligence and Ukrainian SBU or secret police had anything to do with this. I don't know.
How much longer do you think Ukraine can last? We know that the Biden administration wants them to last at least until November 6th. But what is your view about the overwhelming odds favoring the Russians at this point?
Well, if we look at the map, as recently as this morning, we see evidence for the concentration of roughly 300,000 Russian troops in the northeastern corner of Ukraine. These forces are in a position to attack due east and move very rapidly on Kyiv at this point. We still have another 100,000 Russian troops up in Belarusia that no one has talked about or mentioned that could be moved south. In other words, they can very rapidly approach the capital and put everything in the capital in range of their various artillery systems. So I think the end is near. The Russians are very deliberate. They're very cautious. They're not going to move forces forward beyond the umbrella of air and missile defense. Everything is being carefully planned and organized very deliberately. So I think that's going to happen. I don't know how the government in Kiev stays in Kiev. I'd be surprised if they did not pull out and move further west. We know they have plans to go potentially to Lvov in the far western corner of the country. So I think this is the end game. There's no question about it. The sad part is that the Ukrainians are now rounding up whatever men they can find. I'm told that they rounded up from in and around Odessa 3,000 to 5,000 men. Now, I don't know how old they are. Some may be boys, some may be old men. Who knows? But they're definitely scraping the bottom of the barrel, and they're going to throw these people into Russian gunfire. They'll just be killed. But that doesn't seem to matter very much in Kyiv. It doesn't seem to matter in Washington.
Do you think that President Zelensky hangs on and is present at this end game, or the Russians just won't deal with him and maybe the Americans want him to go at some point?
We have assassinated people before that when we decided they were of no further use to us. We can go back to the historical record all the way back to Diem in Vietnam, as you know, Judge. But I would have thought that by now someone inside the Ukrainian military establishment would have stepped forward, at least, with some concern for the remaining lives of Ukrainians, and put an end to this thing. And I think that's something the Russians have looked for, but it hasn't happened. And part of that reason is that Western intelligence services, again, SAS and others, have done an excellent job of protecting Zelensky from any potential inside threat. So I guess he'll last at least until he's killed as a result of eventual Russian assault on Kiev.
Before we switch over to Israel and Gaza, here's President Putin predicting that the West will get rid of President Zelensky when he no longer serves any Western purpose.
And there is a decision of the Constitutional Court of Ukraine of 2015 which says quite clearly that the term of the Ukrainian president is 5 years, no more nor less. What are we even talking about? In the West, I think they just don't want. The West just doesn't want to change a president for a different figure. It's obvious that they have their hands full with other things, and it's Zelensky who'll be charged with making all the unpopular decisions, and after they are done with him, he will be replaced.
After they are done with him, he will be replaced. If history repeats itself, can this last another year?
It seems hard to believe that it could last beyond September, but I don't know. Again, if there's no one willing to step forward and say enough's enough, let's come to some sort of arrangement. And right now, no one in Washington wants to do that. Certainly not before the election, because that would compel them to admit failure and defeat.
Right.
No one in London or Paris seems willing to do that. Now, there is a possibility that you could see a change in government in Germany and France. If that change occurs in the fall or sometime before November, then potentially, yes, you could see this thing end. I think there would be a willingness to negotiate on the part of the Russians with a collection of European states that have said enough's enough, this needs to end. But I don't know, Judge. There's not much left of Ukrainian military power, let's be frank. Right. We're seeing Western, what's the right word, contractors and potentially Western soldiers in civilian clothes or the uniform of the Ukrainian army operate these more complex systems. And the Russians know that. They're going to try to destroy them. They shot down that global hawk that was responsible, at least in their minds, with coordinating this latest strike. So I think the Russians are now going to look for every opportunity to disrupt the command, control, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities that we bring to bear. That could lead to a confrontation. I hope they'll be careful, because that could trigger the very thing that I think no one in their right mind wants, which is a direct confrontation between Russia and the United States.
But we know that contractors are going to get killed if those guys are wearing fatigues but not government issued, and their boots on the ground, and they have weapons in their hands or at the other end of their computers. They're fair game.
Oh, absolutely. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about potential attacks on our satellites in space, as well as attacks on aircraft, manned or unmanned, that are part of this intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance complex, because that's really at heart of what keeps the Ukrainians even in the game.
Right.
There's not much left on the ground as far as an army is concerned. That's in ruins.
The clip
Last week, they lost 13,000 men.
Oof.
This is the sort of thing that happens at the end of a war when an army is collapsing and retreating. That's when most of the damage occurs. You lose more people during a retreat than you do in a stand-up battle. So this is effectively over on the ground. I'm sure the Russians will advance when they feel comfortable doing so. The real question is, how much damage do they do to what I just described, to our intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance complex? I hope that people are more thoughtful than they've been thus far and will keep at least our manned aircraft out of range. But as the Russians advance towards the west, towards that river, they'll be able to take more and more things under fire and destroy them. That's the concern that I have.